Today, you will hear about a war that lasted 335 years. A war so long, it stretched across centuries, kings, revolutions, discoveries, and the changing face of the world. A war so silent that most of the people involved never even knew it was happening. There were no battles, no deaths, no gunfire, only a monumental forgetfulness that kept two nations bound to a phantom conflict for more than 3 centuries. It sounds like fiction, but, like so many of the stories we tell here, it is completely real. So, relax, settle in, and let this curious piece of history slowly unfold, until your eyes begin to close, and all that remains is the quiet image of an ocean, untouched by smoke or gunpowder. Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine. You live your life as usual, day after day, never knowing that, officially, your country is at war. There are no sirens, no trenches, no soldiers marching through the streets. Only a single sheet of paper, signed long ago, forgotten in some dusty drawer of an old diplomatic archive. That paper, unread and unseen, is the only fragile, invisible link between you and a war that never came. Our story begins in the 17th century. But don't rush. Before we dive into causes, characters, and the absurdities of this episode, we need to prepare the stage. The world then was very different. Maritime powers fought over territories as if they were pieces on an endless board. Winds and sails decided the fate of nations. And in the middle of it all, a small cluster of islands, the Isles of Scilly, found themselves lost between shifting alliances, rivalries, and the silence of the sea itself. The strangest part is that this forgotten war never gained fame in its own time. It wasn't reported in newspapers, it wasn't taught in schools, it wasn't used in fiery speeches. It simply existed, like a ghost hidden in the margins of history. If someone had looked carefully at the official records, they would have seen it, state of war. But life carried on. Children were born, fishermen set out to sea, and the loudest sound was still the waves crashing against stone. What makes this story so fascinating is the contrast. We live in a world where wars are remembered through battles, heroes, and tragedies. But here, none of that. This war has no heroes, no villains, no victory, no defeat. It is a war that existed only on paper. And yet, legally, it became the longest war in history. And that contradiction invites us to wonder, is the weight of a war found in the battles fought, or in the simple act of declaring it? As you listen, perhaps you already feel a strange calm forming. It's like gazing at an old painting and realizing that, despite the centuries that have passed, the landscape has not changed. The sea still breaks against the same rocks. The wind still whispers with the same sound. And the document that began this war slept forgotten, just as you now prepare to drift into sleep. But to understand how something like this was possible, we need to travel back together to that time. An age of restless seas, fragile alliances, and decisions made in closed rooms, lit only by candlelight. In that setting, a simple diplomatic formality would become a chain that stretched across 335 years. A chain that, though invisible, bound the fate of the Isles of Scilly to powerful Holland, almost without anyone noticing. So, take a deep breath and let time gently roll backward. Our next step will be to understand the stage of this story, a cluster of remote islands, a small on the map, that, almost by accident, became the backdrop for the longest and most peaceful war the world has ever known. And now, as sleep may already be drawing near, keep this first image with you. The image of a calm ocean separating two peoples who remained at war for more than 3 centuries without ever once facing each other. And notice how, sometimes, forgetfulness can create stories as improbable as they are beautiful, like this one we are about to continue. Imagine an old map, yellowed with time, its edges uneven, with drawings of sailing ships decorating the corners. In the southwest corner of England, almost forgotten by the cartographer, lies a small cluster of dots in the sea. These are the Isles of Scilly, an archipelago of small pieces of land, carved out by the Atlantic Ocean, with pale beaches, gray cliffs, and a wind that never tires of blowing. At first glance, nothing there suggests the stage of a war. Even less so, of a war that would last for centuries. Yet it is precisely here that this story begins to anchor itself. The Scilly Isles had always been far from the great political movements of England. The inhabitants lived from fishing, sailing, and small plots of farmland, their lives guided by the tides and the seasons. But in the 17th century, isolation was no guarantee of safety. The sea that brought food and trade also carried soldiers, privateers, and foreign flags. The maritime routes that passed close to the islands were contested by the great powers of the time, and within them lay the reason why Scilly would eventually be drawn into an unlikely conflict. England itself was then in turmoil. The English Civil War divided the country between royalists and parliamentarians, and even remote regions like the Scilly Isles were touched by these internal struggles. The archipelago became a haven for royalist ships, those who supported King Charles I. And by sheltering these vessels, the islands unwittingly placed themselves upon an international chessboard far larger than they could have imagined. Across the North Sea, the Dutch Republic was watching closely. Holland and England were fierce commercial rivals. Any strategic point on the water could mean either advantage or threat. And when royalist privateers, sheltered in the Scilly Isles, began attacking Dutch ships, the Dutch government did not see it as a mere nuisance, but as a danger that demanded a response. Curiously, despite the rising tension, life in the Scilly Isles remained slow and steady. Picture a small harbor with wooden boats, fishermen mending nets, children running along the shore, while in distant chambers, diplomats and generals argued over who did or did not have the right to control that stretch of sea. It is in this contrast, between the simple pace of island life and the vast stage of global politics, that the seed of a war without battles began to grow. Geography also played its silent role. Because they were isolated, the Scilly Isles were both easy to forget and impossible to ignore. Like a tiny speck that insists on lingering in the corner of one's vision. They were not wealthy, nor powerful, nor populous. But they lay in the right and wrong place for armed ships to pass through. And in the 17th century, the harbor where a ship dropped anchor could alter the course of history. In the years that followed, the winds of the Atlantic continued to carry stories from afar. Rumors of wars, news of treaties signed in lands the islanders could scarcely find on a map. Yet none of those rumors prepared the Scilly Isles for the role they would, without intending, come to play, that of being the target of a formal declaration of war issued by one of the greatest maritime powers in the world. And so, the stage was set. On one side, a small archipelago, living at its own rhythm, content in its simplicity. On the other, a commercial empire that saw in Scilly a base for dangerous enemies. Between them, the vast and unpredictable sea. It was a strange combination, almost improbable, yet one that would give rise to a conflict unlike any other recorded in history. In the next chapter, we will journey further into the heart of that century, to understand the tense and unstable climate that weighed over all of Europe. A century of political storms and fragile alliances, where even the smallest misstep could ignite a declaration of war. It is there, within that whirlwind, that the story of the 335 years war begins to take shape. For now, picture the Isles of Scilly at dusk. The sun sinking slowly beyond the horizon, the sea glowing with gold, and a cold wind carrying the scent of salt and silence. No one there knew it yet, but a document, signed far away, was beginning to write the longest and most peaceful war the world has ever known. To understand how a place as small as the Isles of Scilly ended up caught in a war that lasted 335 years, we must look at the world of the 17th century. It was a time of dangerous seas, not only because of natural storms, but also because of storms created by men. The European powers moved in a constant dance of alliances and rivalries, where a handshake could mean peace one day, and the next declared war. Maritime trade was the lifeblood of the most powerful nations. England, Holland, Spain, France, and Portugal fought over routes and colonies as if they were precious pieces on an invisible board. The sea, beyond being a path to riches, was also a stage for ambushes, blockades, and naval battles that could shift the balance of power in a matter of days. Every ship that set sail carried not only goods, but also the pride and the security of its country. Holland, at the time, was living through what we call its golden century. It was a commercial power without precedent, with swift ships, explorers crossing oceans, and harbors overflowing with goods from every corner of the world. But that success drew enemies, and one of the fiercest rivals was none other than England, whose navy was rapidly expanding, and whose commercial interests frequently collided with those of the Dutch. In England, things were no less turbulent. The Civil War divided the country between royalists, who defended King Charles I, and parliamentarians, who sought to limit his power. While London and other cities pulsed with speeches and political battles, the conflict spread to the seas. Ships took sides, blockades were enforced, and the loyalty of each port could sway the course of the war. It was in this atmosphere that the Isles of Scilly quietly entered the stage. Small, isolated, yet positioned on a strategic route, they became a refuge for royalist ships. Those ships, in turn, began attacking Dutch vessels, turning the archipelago into a point of tension on the already complicated European chessboard. What's curious is that, at the time, a single act of aggression at sea could carry the weight of war. It didn't require an invasion of land. One seized ship, one stolen cargo, or even the threat of attack could bring relations between nations to collapse. And when the royalist privateers, operating out of Scilly, became too great a nuisance, Holland felt compelled to respond. Meanwhile, life on the islands carried its strange duality. On one side, fishermen and farmers tended to their daily work. On the other, armed men, war banners, and ships ready to sail gave the archipelago the air of an outpost in an international struggle. The islanders lived between the salty smell of the sea and the distant echo of decisions made by leaders who would likely never set foot there. The 17th century has been called by some historians the century of endless wars in Europe. There were conflicts on land and at sea, battles of religion, politics, and commerce. The political map shifted constantly, redrawn as if with each passing decade. And in the middle of this chaos, small and quiet Scilly found itself, unintentionally, placed as a piece in this game of power. It was the perfect backdrop for a simple diplomatic incident to become something much larger. A declaration of war could be made swiftly, but its cancellation, that was often lost to forgetfulness. And it is in that detail, in that almost invisible flaw of the diplomatic machinery, that the world's longest war was born, a war that, ironically, never saw a drop of blood spilled. The sea, silent witness to it all, continued its endless cycle. Waves came and went, indifferent to treaties and flags. Natural storms battered ships with the same force that political storms battered the ties between nations. And so, little by little, the fate of the Isles of Scilly was woven into the history of Holland by a thread that would take centuries to be cut. Sometimes in history, great conflicts do not begin with gunfire, but with small, almost imperceptible gestures. A suspicious glance, a ship in the wrong place, a paper hastily signed. In the case of the war that lasted 335 years, it all began with a formality, and with a rush to respond to a nuisance that, for some, was little more than a footnote in the affairs of the day. The year was 1651. The English Civil War was nearing its end. King Charles I had already been executed, but some of his supporters, the Royalists, continued to resist. Many of them sought refuge in safe harbors, from which they launched attacks against ships they deemed enemies. The Isles of Scilly, with their remote and difficult-to-reach location, became one of these refuges. Among the ships anchored in the archipelago were privateers who did not hesitate to attack Dutch vessels. And here lay the problem. Holland, though not directly involved in the English Civil War, wished to maintain good commercial relations with the English parliamentarians, while at the same time protecting its maritime trade. When the attacks grew frequent, the Dutch decided they could no longer ignore the situation. Admiral Martin Tromp, one of the most renowned figures of the Dutch Navy, was sent to the region to deal with the problem. He was not there to negotiate endlessly or to exchange diplomatic letters that would take months to arrive. His mission was simple: ensure the safety of Dutch ships. And to do so, he needed an official act that would legitimize his actions. Thus, in a swift gesture, a formal declaration of war was made against the Isles of Scilly. Not against all of England, only against the archipelago, which, in the Dutch view, served as an enemy base. At that moment, no one could have imagined that this signature would create a state of war that would stretch across centuries. Curiously, only a few months later, the situation changed. Parliamentary forces seized control of the islands, expelling the royalists and bringing an end to the threat against Dutch ships. And with that, the reason for the war simply disappeared. But no one remembered to bring the conflict to an official close. There was no meeting to discuss peace, no treaty signed. The declaration of war remained valid, stored in the archives, while everyone went on with their lives. And so it was that chance turned into history. An administrative gesture, made to resolve an immediate problem, became the seed of one of the strangest episodes in diplomacy. It is as if someone had forgotten a candle burning in a corner, but in this case, the flame never consumed anything. It simply stayed there, almost invisible, crossing the centuries. Imagine the islanders at that moment. Perhaps some had heard that Holland had declared war, but with the political shift, the news quickly faded among so many others. After all, there were no soldiers landing, no cannons pointed toward the beaches. The sea still brought in fish, the wind still blew, and life carried on at its slow rhythm. Yet, in the official records, one word remained written: war. A simple word, but one heavy with meaning. A word that, through neglect or indifference, was left unaltered for more than 3 centuries. If we think about it, the story could have ended right there, in 1651. All it would have taken was for someone, someday, to remember to send a document, to sign an agreement. But the 17th century was not in a hurry for such formalities. Communications were slow, priorities shifted, and far more urgent conflicts demanded the attention of leaders. And so, the Scilly War lingered in suspension, forgotten, like a distant echo of a quarrel that no longer existed. What began as a practical measure to protect commercial ships would, in time, transform into a curious anecdote, and later into a diplomatic legend. But to reach that point, 3 centuries of silence had to pass. 3 centuries in which the war had no battles, and yet remained alive, on paper. The Isles of Scilly are a small archipelago, scattered like a handful of precious stones over the Atlantic, southwest of England. Formed by about 140 islets, though only 5 are permanently inhabited, they have always lived in a delicate balance between isolation and connection with the world. The sea is, at the same time, a road and a barrier. It brings goods and visitors, but it also creates distance, imposes its own rhythm, and shapes the life and destiny of those who dwell there. In the 17th century, these islands were far from being just an idyllic landscape. They were a strategic point for anyone sailing through the English Channel and the North Atlantic. The sea currents and geography made them ideal for resupplying and for shelter against storms. But for that very reason, they also drew the interest of naval forces and privateers who saw in Scilly a safe harbor from which to strike enemy vessels. When the English royalists sought refuge there, they were taking advantage of this favorable geography. The natural harbors and the distance from the mainland offered protection from the parliamentarians. But what they may not have realized was that this choice placed the islands in an invisible line of fire. By sheltering ships that attacked the Dutch fleet, Scilly, even without intent, became a point of international friction. And here lies the curiosity. The islands themselves had no significant military power. Their inhabitants were fishermen, farmers, and local traders. Most of the fighting force stationed there came from outside, crews more interested in raiding enemy ships than in mingling with the quiet life of the locals. Yet, in the eyes of the Netherlands, the archipelago represented a threat. The image we can form of Scilly at that time is that of a paradoxical place. In the morning, fishermen would set out to sea in small boats, casting their nets and returning with baskets of fish. In the afternoon, at the ports, one might see armed ships with tall sails and flags waving, ready to hunt down enemy vessels. Two worlds coexisting in the same space, the peaceful everyday life of the islanders and the invisible tension of geopolitics. The island's role in the war that would last centuries was, in part, passive. They did not seek conflict, but by becoming a base of operations for the Royalists, they were inevitably drawn into it. It is as if they had been pulled into a power struggle far greater than their own scale. This is perhaps one of the reasons why the episode carries such a peculiar tone. There was no local hatred toward the Dutch, no desire for battle. Only circumstances that placed Scilly's name on a declaration of war. And, as we have seen, the declaration made by Admiral Martin Tromp was never revoked. When the parliamentarians seized the islands and drove out the Royalists, the immediate danger to the Netherlands vanished. But the signed document remained valid. And so, unknowingly, Scilly came to bear the symbolic weight of a war that did not exist. In the centuries that followed, the islands went on with their peaceful life. Fishing, farming, and later tourism became their main activities. The sea breeze continued to blow across the fields, and life kept its slow rhythm as if nothing had changed. Yet, in the records, the archipelago was still at war with the Netherlands. It is curious to think that, while major European conflicts came and went, the Napoleonic Wars, the First and Second World Wars, Scilly remained untouched by direct combat. The very sea that isolated them also protected them. Their only link to the world of war was that forgotten state of conflict, an almost invisible note in the diplomatic archives. The role of the Isles of Scilly, therefore, was not that of active protagonists. They were a stage, the setting of a brief act whose consequences would stretch far beyond what anyone could have imagined. A reminder of how small places can carry immense stories, not for what they did, but for what they represented at a given moment in history. In history, there are documents that redraw borders, crown kings, and liberate peoples. And there are others that, without much fanfare, change the destiny of a place in an almost invisible way. The declaration of war made by the Netherlands against the Isles of Scilly in 1651 belongs to this second category. It was not written to enter the history books, and perhaps that is precisely why it survived silently, crossing centuries without ever being undone. The scene, if we can imagine it, is simple. Admiral Martin Tromp, with his fleet anchored near the islands, receives reports that Royalist ships sheltered there continued to attack Dutch vessels. The government of the Dutch Republic, far away, had already decided it was necessary to give an official response. Tromp then signs the declaration of war. The document, probably drafted with the typical formality of the time, stated the reasons for the act: to protect Dutch trade and punish those who, from the Scilly Isles, threatened its ships. There was no mention in the text of large-scale invasions or plans for battle. It was more of a formal authorization, a legal backing for Trump to act if necessary. But the mere fact of its existence made the relationship officially belligerent. And once war is declared, there is an inevitable next step that must follow: declaring peace. That step, as we know, never came. A few months later, the English parliamentarians regained control of the islands. The royalists fled, and the threat to Dutch ships disappeared. For all involved, the problem seemed resolved. Trump's fleet departed, Scilly returned to its routine, and the war that had been declared was forgotten. Forgotten, however, only in practice, because in the archives, the paper bearing the admiral's signature remained valid, resting in silence. 17th century diplomacy was not swift. Communications between nations depended on messengers, sea voyages, and a constant game of priorities. When a crisis ended, not all its resolutions were always formally recorded. Treaties and agreements were signed when there was immediate political interest. Otherwise, certain details were simply left for later, and sometimes, as in the case of Scilly, forever. The document that began this war is, therefore, a curious symbol. It not only created a state of official belligerence, but also became a perfect example of how bureaucracy can shape history. A signature, perhaps made in just a few minutes, produced a conflict that, on paper, lasted more than 3 centuries. There are no detailed records of exactly where the original text was kept over all that time. Perhaps it was filed away in some Dutch government office, alongside piles of treaties, letters, and decrees from other conflicts. The fact is that for more than 300 years, no one bothered to remove it. Meanwhile, the Isles of Scilly carried on oblivious to it all. Fishermen cast their nets, farmers tended their fields, and time passed in cycles of tides and seasons. No islander awoke thinking, "We are at war with the Netherlands." But in the diplomatic records, that was the truth. A truth forgotten, silent, and strangely peaceful. The idea that a document can keep a war alive without battles leads us to a reflection. What defines, in fact, the beginning and the end of a conflict? Is it the moment when weapons fall silent? Or the instant when a piece of paper is signed? In the case of Scilly, the answer is clear. Weapons never spoke, but the paper stood firm, carrying alone the weight of a state of war that no one ever lived. The silence that followed the declaration of war was so deep, it seemed to erase the very fact that it had been made. With the royalists fleeing the Isles of Scilly and peace returning to the Channel, there was no longer any practical reason for the Netherlands to concern itself with that small territory. The war, still fresh on paper, came to exist only as a formality stored away in some distant archive. The islands returned to their routine. Small fishing boats crossed the clear waters. The sound of the tides against the rocks replaced any echo of cannon fire that, in truth, had never been heard. Local trade kept its modest rhythm, sustained more by fishing and farming than by major exchanges. And as time went on, the memory of that brief moment of tension dissolved into everyday life. Perhaps, in the first years after the signing, someone still remembered Admiral Trump and his fleet anchored nearby. Perhaps some child heard stories about the Dutch who came to make war, and imagined grand battles at sea. But as the decades passed, those memories became scattered fragments, like shells forgotten on the sand after the tide. In the Netherlands, the picture was not much different. The nation's attention was fixed on other challenges: real wars, expanding maritime trade, colonial disputes in distant lands. The episode of the Scilly was so small, so irrelevant compared to other events, that it was swallowed by institutional forgetfulness. No one, when reviewing the treaties and conflicts of the 17th century, seemed to care whether that state of war was still in effect. Thus, a paradox emerged. Officially, the war was ongoing. In reality, it did not exist. No soldier, English or Dutch, spent his days worrying about an offensive in the Scillies. No islander feared an attack. There were no trenches, no patrols, no blockades. The war survived only in documents, a pale shadow cast upon history, visible only to those who knew where to look. It is curious to think how something as serious as war can be erased from collective memory. Perhaps because, at its core, it was never perceived as a real threat. A war without battles awakens no fear, leaves no visible wounds, raises no monuments in memory of the dead. It becomes nothing more than a bureaucratic detail, hidden under layers of time. Over the centuries, new generations were born and died in the Scillies without ever hearing of this story. Ships continued to cut across the horizon, not as messengers of conflict, but as carriers of fresh fish, letters, and goods. The war remained alive only in the most unlikely of places, a forgotten archive. And yet, that silence carried a strange potential. For even if no one remembered it, the war could be rediscovered at any moment. All it would take was someone, while reviewing old documents, to stumble upon Admiral Tromp's signature and wonder, but was this never settled? That coincidence would take more than 3 centuries to occur. The case of the forgotten War of the Scillies reminds us that time does not erase documents. What changes is our relationship with them. A piece of paper may pass through generations unread, until a curious eye brings it back to light. And when that happens, history reinvents itself, not because the facts change, but because we begin to perceive them again. Time, patient and silent, began to cover the forgotten war of the Isles of Scilly as one covers an old object with dust. Decade after decade, century after century, life followed its course, indifferent to the fact that, in the records, the Netherlands and that small British territory were still officially at war. The apparent peace became something so solid and natural that no one ever questioned its legitimacy. By the end of the 17th century, while empires rose and fell, the Scilly Isles remained almost unchanged. Their coastal villages kept their slow pace, and the main concern of the inhabitants was always the sea, sometimes generous, bringing an abundance of fish, sometimes merciless, taking lives in sudden storms. Homes were warmed by simple hearths, and daily life revolved around the tides, not international treaties. The 18th century brought new winds to Europe: Napoleonic wars, revolutions, and the rise of new naval powers. Yet none of these upheavals seemed to reach the islands. At times, foreign ships appeared on the horizon, but they were more curious visitors than threats. In London, Parliament debated distant colonies and global trade, never remembering that, on paper, there remained an unresolved conflict with the Netherlands. Throughout the 19th century, industrialization began to change the world. The sound of steam engines replaced the song of sails in the larger ports, but in the Scilly Isles, change came more slowly. Small improvements arrived little by little. Slightly more modern boats, more efficient lighthouses to guide sailors through treacherous waters. And even with great colonial wars taking place overseas, the territory remained untouched, immersed in a peace that seemed as natural as the seasons. By the 20th century, the world would experience conflicts on a scale never before seen. World wars would redraw maps, entire nations would disappear or emerge, and treaties would be signed and torn up within years. Yet the war with the Scilly Isles remained invisible. Not even during the Second World War, when German submarines roamed the Atlantic and the British Isles faced real threat, did anyone recall the Netherlands as an enemy. For, in truth, it was already an ally against a common foe. It is curious to think that the longest peace between two enemies was not the result of skillful negotiations, but of simple forgetfulness. No one in the British government seemed inclined to check archives from centuries past, and no one in the Netherlands had any interest in reopening the matter. Thus, for more than 300 years, the war existed only as a dead detail in an ancient document. Meanwhile, life went on. Children were born and grew up running along the beaches. Sailors departed and returned with stories of storms and encounters at sea. The Scilly Isles remained a haven, a quiet point on the map. What the world did not know was that this calm rested upon a dormant legal detail, ready to be discovered at any moment. This apparent peace, sustained by forgetfulness, reminds us that history does not always follow logical lines. Some conflicts last a short time yet leave deep scars, while others last for centuries, without leaving any mark at all. And perhaps it is precisely this that makes the case of the Scilly Isles so unique. The fact that, while the world stirred, they remained untouched, unaware that they were the stage of one of the longest and most useless conflicts in history. Sometimes history is not awakened by great battles or fiery speeches, but by almost trivial gestures. That was how, after more than 3 centuries, the war between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly resurfaced, not out of strategic interest, but because of the pure curiosity of a man who, perhaps, was simply looking for an unusual story to share among friends. It was the 1980s. The world was living under the tension of the Cold War, but it also allowed itself lighter distractions. On the Scillies, daily life went on as calmly as ever. The sea still set the rhythm of the days, and, in the evenings, locals gathered in pubs to talk about fishing, football, and, every now and then, old shipwreck stories. It was during one of those quiet moments that Roy Duncan, chairman of the local council, heard a casual mention of the forgotten war with the Netherlands. At first, it sounded like a joke. After all, there were no cannons aimed at the horizon, nor Dutch patrols circling the coast. But Roy, a naturally curious man with a love for historical records, decided to investigate. Perhaps he expected to find a poorly told local legend. But the truth, as always, was stranger than fiction. Upon consulting old documents, Roy realized that, in fact, there was no record of a formal peace treaty between the Scillies and the Netherlands since the 17th century. The war that had been declared, though never fought, remained officially open on paper. The discovery was met with laughter by the community, since the idea of being technically at war with a European country after 300 years sounded more absurd than threatening. But curiosity is not satisfied with silence. Roy decided to write directly to the Dutch embassy in London, explaining the situation and asking, with good humor, whether it might not be time to finally declare peace. The letter was received with equal surprise and amusement by the diplomats who, after checking their own archives, confirmed that, yes, officially, the conflict still existed. From there, chance turned into opportunity. The Dutch government, seeing in this a symbolic and light-hearted moment in a world otherwise filled with political tensions, agreed to the idea of signing a formal treaty. It was almost diplomatic theater, but with a poetic touch, ending with a simple handshake, a war that had never truly been fought. What could have remained a forgotten footnote soon attracted media attention. Small British and Dutch newspapers published curious notes about the end of the longest war in history, even though, in practice, it was only the conclusion of a centuries-old misunderstanding. Still, there was something charming about it, a reminder that not every conflict has to end in tragedy, and that some may end with laughter and a toast. Little by little, a date was set for the peace ceremony. Representatives from the Netherlands would travel to the Scillies before local authorities officially closed the conflict. There would be no military parades, no fiery speeches, only the acknowledgement that history sometimes writes chapters as improbable as they are comforting. In this case, chance not only uncovered a curious detail, but also built an invisible bridge between two places that, despite the war, had never seen each other as enemies. The ceremony that officially ended the longest war in history was marked by an almost poetic simplicity. There were no flags lowered, no cannons echoing across the horizon. Instead, there was a handshake, a few smiles, and the almost unbelievable feeling that, at last, a 335-year-old conflict had come to an end. The event took place in the Isles of Scilly, on a calm afternoon when the Atlantic wind blew gently, mixing the salty scent of the sea with the fragrance of flowers blooming in the small coastal villages. Representatives from the Netherlands arrived in a modest boat, its white sails reflecting the light of the setting sun. On the British side, local authorities waited cordially, aware that they were about to close a unique chapter in the history of world diplomacy. At the heart of it all was the document, a modern parchment meant to replace the original long forgotten in ancient archives. Upon it, carefully worded sentences acknowledged both the absurdity and the beauty of the situation. A war declared in the 17th century, never fought, and kept alive through neglect or forgetfulness until the end of the 20th century. The text required no threats or complex clauses. It simply needed to recognize the end of the conflict. When the representatives stepped forward to sign, the gesture seemed small, yet carried immense symbolic weight. The pen slid across the paper, and with that simple act, what had officially been a war was transformed into history. A smile spread among those present, not for any military triumph, but for the lightness of closing something so absurd with grace. For the islanders, the ceremony carried a curious flavor. Some laughed at the situation, others shook their heads in disbelief at the fact that, technically, they had lived under a state of war for centuries without knowing it. But everyone agreed on one thing. The story, however bizarre, reminded them that human documents and decisions do not always reflect the reality of daily life. In the Netherlands, the news also sparked surprise and amusement. Journalists wrote about the longest war without battles, and historians began to discuss the episode as a unique case of bureaucracy, chance, and the persistence of time. For many, it was a reminder that history is not only made of great deeds, but also of small details that, by being so unexpected, take on a life of their own. What is most enchanting about this episode is that the final piece did not bring glories, medals, or grand celebrations. It brought something subtler, a sense of completeness, that even mistakes, forgetfulness, and absurdities can be corrected, even after centuries. The handshake that sealed the treaty is a reminder that, often, the resolution of a conflict does not require force, but attention and the willingness to mend what has been left unresolved. As the sun set over the archipelago, painting the sea with shades of orange and gold, there was a deep sense of tranquility. The waves lapped against the rocks, soft and steady, as if silently celebrating the return of normality. Nothing had changed in the island's routine. Fishermen still returned with their nets, children still played on the beaches, and the world moved on, indifferent to the small ceremony that had ended an unprecedented war. And yet, something had changed, on paper, and that was enough for the episode to remain in collective memory, a curious reminder of how chance, bureaucracy, and time can intertwine. A forgotten document, a belated signature, and a simple gesture of recognition were enough to transform centuries of useless formality into a story that continues to fascinate historians and dreamers to this day. If there is one thing the history of the Isles of Scilly War teaches us, it is that not every conflict needs to be dramatic to be significant. A war can last for centuries without a single shot being fired, without trenches dug or flags burned. And yet, it still leaves lessons, profound and silent, that stretch across generations. The first lesson is about time. 335 years of war in the archives show that bureaucracy alone can keep something alive even without action. Time does not erase documents, it merely places them on hold between the pages of history. The world changed over those centuries, empires fell, new nations emerged, yet the paper remained there, silent, reminding us that official records can survive any circumstance. The second lesson lies in absence. What is most striking is not the war itself, but the fact that it existed without existing. There were no casualties, no destruction. This reminds us that reality and historical record do not always walk hand in hand. A conflict can be formal, legal, technical, and yet completely invisible in the lives of people. It is a reflection on how we perceive history. We often focus only on what is visible, forgetting that documents, decisions, and signatures also carry weight. The third lesson comes from chance. The discovery of the war by Roy Duncan, almost as a joke, shows us that history can be reawakened at any moment. Chance is a thread that connects present and past, reminding us that human curiosity has the power to uncover forgotten worlds. The Scilly War remained invisible until someone looked at the old archives with care. It is a reminder that small actions can trigger unexpected events, even centuries later. The fourth lesson is about lightness. When peace was finally signed, there were no grand rituals, no military celebrations. Only acknowledgement and a shared smile between representatives of two peoples who, in fact, had never faced each other. This teaches us that not every conflict needs to end with violence. Some can be resolved with attention, dialogue, and goodwill. And perhaps it is this lightness that makes the story even more fascinating, as it contrasts with the absurd duration of the war. The fifth lesson is about memory and forgetting. For centuries, the Isles of Scilly lived in peace without realizing that, officially, they were at war. This reminds us that forgetting is not always negative. Sometimes it allows life to go on, letting routine prevail over formalities, and letting people's daily lives continue naturally, regardless of decisions made in distant offices. And finally, there is the lesson about history as narrative. This episode shows us that history is not only made of great battles or revolutions. It is also composed of absurdities, oversights, and coincidences. The Scilly War is a story that makes us smile, reflect, and imagine, because it combines concrete facts with almost surreal situations. It reminds us that reality often surpasses fiction, and that human life, with all its unpredictability, is full of small miracles of meaning. When we think of the Isles of Scilly today, we can imagine them as a haven of tranquility, a place where the sea sets the rhythm and history unfolds without hurry. Yet somewhere in a distant archive still rests the memory of a war that lasted centuries, without anyone fighting. It is a reminder that history is alive, that time is patient, and that sometimes the greatest lessons come from conflicts that, in practice, never existed. The story of the Isles of Scilly War would not have been complete without the curiosity of an ordinary person. Roy Duncan, by investigating a casual remark about a forgotten conflict, demonstrated how human attention can awaken dormant episodes, bringing to light facts that seemed lost in time. This is one of the most subtle and powerful forces in history, the ability to look back with attentive eyes and notice what has gone unnoticed. Curiosity is not merely a personal trait, it is a link between the present and the past. By opening dusty archives, examining old documents, and questioning seemingly irrelevant information, Duncan reconnected two worlds that, though separated by centuries, still shared an invisible bond, the paper that kept the war alive. Without this individual pursuit, the war would have remained forever a forgotten footnote, a curious detail recorded only in diplomatic archives, inaccessible to collective memory. What this episode teaches us is that history is not a continuous river, but a lake full of hidden currents. Some of these currents remain invisible until someone dives in, curious, seeking to understand more than the surface allows. A simple gesture, reading, investigating, questioning, can transform our understanding of the past, changing not the events themselves but our perception of them. Curiosity also brings lightness to historical narrative. Without it, the Scilly War would have remained a dull bureaucratic detail. But the attention of one individual made the story enchanting, almost poetic. A war that lasted 335 years without battles, finally resolved through laughter, handshakes, and mutual acknowledgement. In this sense, human curiosity has the power to transform the old into something alive, capable of making us smile, reflect, and dream. Moreover, Duncan's action shows that history is not made solely by rulers, kings, or generals. It is also shaped by ordinary citizens who choose to examine archives, question routines, or investigate small details. These interactions often rescue forgotten episodes, allowing the past to converse with the present in unexpected ways. Another important point is the connection between curiosity and chance. Without the chance that led Duncan to hear that casual reference to the war, nothing would have happened. Yet curiosity transformed that chance into concrete action. It is a reminder that history depends as much on fortuitous elements as on conscious choices, and that small gestures can have far greater repercussions than we imagine. The Scilly War, then, teaches us that looking at the past with attention is both an act of responsibility and of imagination. It allows ancient events to reveal not only facts but stories full of humor, irony, and subtle lessons. Every document, signature, and forgotten archive may contain secrets that, once discovered, expand our understanding of the world. The Isles of Scilly War gradually became a curious and almost poetic symbol, a dispute that lasted 335 years, yet never involved combat, bloodshed, or destruction. It reminds us that not all wars are made of explicit violence, and that, in some cases, history unfolds in documents, signatures, and forgetfulness, rather than in trenches and battles. As a symbol, this conflict without confrontation invites reflection on the nature of authority and formalism. A piece of paper, signed in the 17th century, maintained a state of enmity for centuries, even without any practical action. This shows how formal structures can exist independently of concrete reality, sustaining conflicts that, in practice, never materialized. It is a reminder that the power of the written word, bureaucracy, and signature can outlast any armed conflict. At the same time, this war became an icon of the patience of time. For more than 3 centuries, the world continued to turn, empires fell, new nations emerged, and the islands remained virtually untouched. The calm of the Scilly Islands, contrasting with the formality of a state of war, creates an almost surreal narrative. The world in motion, and a war that existed only on paper, waiting to be rediscovered. Another symbolic aspect is irony. It is rare in history to find a conflict that lasts so long without causing direct suffering. This irony makes the Isles of Scilly War fascinating. It challenges our expectations of what it means to be at war. It reminds us that history is not only about dramatic events, but also about absurdities that persist silently, prompting us to question social, political, and bureaucratic conventions. The symbol also extends to human curiosity. It was through an attentive eye, a desire to investigate something unusual, that the war was finally concluded. This detail shows how the actions of a single person can give new meaning to something forgotten, transforming the past into a living story capable of teaching and entertaining simultaneously. The Scilly War, therefore, is not merely a historical document. It is a narrative about the impact of individual attention and curiosity. Moreover, the episode highlights the subtlety of history when compared to everyday life. For the island inhabitants, the conflict never truly existed. They lived in peace, following the rhythms of the sea, the tides, and the seasons, unaware that, in some distant archive, they were officially at war. The disparity between the reality of life and the formal record creates a poetic contrast. Official history exists, but real human experience is different, gentler and continuous. The symbol of this conflict without combat also serves as a reflection on time and collective memory. It shows that historical events can be forgotten, rediscovered, or reinterpreted, depending on the lens through which they are revisited. History is not fixed. It is shaped by interest, attention, and chance. In this case, chance combined with curiosity to create an unexpected and charming ending, closing a war that never occurred in practical terms but taught much about bureaucracy, patience, and absurdity. Looking at the Isles of Scilly today, we can see them as a refuge of calm, a space where time seems to slow, reflecting the paradox of this conflict without battles. The sea continues to lap gently against the rocks, seagulls still cut across the sky, and life follows its course. Amid it all remains the symbolic reminder that not every war needs to be violent to exist, and not every peace requires complex treaties to manifest. Sometimes, history reveals itself through laughter, irony, or absurdity. The Isles of Scilly War is a perfect example of this. Imagine for a moment an official conflict recorded in diplomatic documents that lasted 335 years, without a single battle, without injuries, without cannons fired. The fact itself is so strange that it provokes an almost involuntary smile, even when reflecting on its historical significance. The humor in this episode arises from the contradiction between bureaucratic formality and everyday reality. Officially, the islanders were at war. In practice, nothing changed. Fishermen, farmers, and children ran along the beaches, unaware of any conflict. Ships crossed the waters as always, carrying fish, goods, and messages. The mismatch between the official record and real life creates a comic effect, showing that history does not always align with common sense. Another amusing aspect is how the war's conclusion came about. Decades of silence and forgetfulness culminated in an almost casual discovery, followed by light-hearted letters exchanged between the islanders and Dutch diplomats. The final signing of the treaty, with smiles and handshakes, seemed more like a theatrical gesture than an act of war. It is impossible not to see in this sequence of events a historical comedy, where bureaucracy and chance combine in a surprisingly gentle way. The episode also reminds us that humor is a powerful lens for understanding the past. It allows us to observe history without the tension of drama or tragedy, offering a space for reflection that is both gentle and delightful. Laughing at a war that lasted centuries without combat helps us recognize human peculiarities, how capable we are of creating formalities that outlive practical necessity. Moreover, the humor stems from the absurd logic of the event itself. A war officially existing, yet completely inactive, defies our expectations of what conflict means. It is living irony. The document existed, the state of war existed, yet no one remembered it, and no one suffered because of it. This juxtaposition between formal gravity and the lightness of reality makes the story irresistibly comic, without exaggeration or invention. And yet, the laughter does not diminish the lesson's value. On the contrary, it reinforces the extraordinary nature of the episode. Laughing at the Scilly War also acknowledges the ingenuity and power of bureaucracy, the role of chance in bringing history back to life, and the patience of time that allows absurdities to endure until they are finally understood. It is a reminder that not all absurdity is useless. Some teach us about life, memory, and human perception. Humor in history acts as a bridge between the past and the present. It brings us closer to people who lived in different contexts, showing that even amid centuries of formalities, we can connect with them through irony and surprise. The actions of Roy Duncan and the simple gesture of signing a treaty become a light, almost literary narrative, capable of delighting and making us smile. Finally, the Scilly War reminds us that history does not have to be solemn or epic. There is beauty and learning in small episodes, absurd details, and unexpected situations. Laughing at a war that never practically existed brings us closer to the humanity that always lies behind every document, every signature, and every formal act. The Isles of Scilly War is, above all, a quiet reminder of the power of bureaucracy. A single piece of paper, signed in the 17th century, kept a state of war alive for more than 300 years, without shots fired, without injuries, without monuments. The formality of the signature, the existence of the document, and its recording in official archives demonstrate that bureaucracy can, in a sense, create eternity, not for the conflict itself, but for the act of documenting it. In practice, bureaucracy is often seen as heavy, slow, even irritating. Yet, in this case, it played a curious role. It kept alive the memory of a war that never truly existed. Without the Dutch admiral's signature and the subsequent official documentation, no one centuries later could have traced this singular episode of a conflict without battles. The paper, therefore, became a bridge between past and present, preserving something that would otherwise have been forgotten. The power of bureaucracy here is paradoxical. It keeps formalities alive even when the real world ignores or transcends them. For the inhabitants of the Scilly Isles, nothing changed over 3.5 centuries. For diplomats, the war existed as a concept, a record, a legal obligation. This coexistence between reality and formality creates a poetic contrast. Life moves on, indifferent, while the paper silently maintains the echo of a war that never was. Moreover, bureaucracy reveals its almost eternal nature. Archives, treaties, and signatures endure through time, while people, cities, and empires change. The Scilly War officially lasted centuries because the formal record remained unaltered. This makes us reflect on the longevity of words and documents, and how they can outlast the physical existence of those involved, carrying a piece of history even when no one remembers it. There is also a poetic dimension to this power. Bureaucracy, usually associated with rigidity, becomes a guardian of time. It preserves absurdities, curiosities, and peculiarities of history that would otherwise be lost. Without archives, without records, the Scilly War would never have been rediscovered, and the charming episode that makes us smile today would have vanished into the mists of the past. This role of bureaucracy reminds us that history is not only what happens but also what is recorded. Formality may seem distant from real life, yet, paradoxically, it ensures that small, funny, or absurd events survive to teach and entertain us. The eternity of a bureaucratic act contrasts with the ephemerality of human experience, showing that documents have their own time, silent and patient. Finally, the Scilly War teaches us that the power of bureaucracy lies not in physical action but in the memory it creates. A simple written record can span centuries, influence people who never existed at the time, and transform a forgotten detail into a fascinating story. The signing of a treaty, the maintenance of archives, the formal recording, all of this keeps fragments of the past alive, allowing history to reveal itself in unexpected ways. The Isles of Scilly War, though non-existent in terms of battles, found its place in collective memory precisely because of its absurdity. Episodes like this show that history is not only made of great deeds, bloodshed, or epic conquests. It is also composed of curious details that make us smile and reflect, reminding us that humans, at heart, are naturally curious and capable of laughing even at the most formal situations. Historical laughter arises from the incongruity between expectation and reality. We expect a war to involve conflict, cannons, and heroism. When we discover that the Scilly War lasted over 3 centuries without a single battle, we are confronted with such a stark contrast that irony transforms into humor. This kind of humor is gentle, contemplative, different from impulsive laughter. It makes us think, imagine, and, in a way, sleep more lightly, aware that the world is full of silent absurdities. Collective memory is also nourished by human curiosity. Stories like that of the Scilly Isles become shared narratives because someone discovers them, tells them, and preserves them. Roy Duncan, through his discreet investigation, became part of a process that connects past and present. His attention allowed the world to know about a war no one experienced, and yet, it teaches us about the power of chance, bureaucracy, and human perception. Historical laughter, in this context, acts as a thread that connects generations. It allows adults and children, historians and lay people alike, to share an intellectual and emotional experience simultaneously. By laughing at a war without battles, we celebrate absurdity, but we also recognize the nuances of history, that it is not linear, that it is not always serious, and that seemingly useless episodes can hold profound value when observed with attention and imagination. Furthermore, collective memory transforms absurdity into legacy. Archives, books, articles, and accounts preserve the story of the Scilly Isles as an example of how extraordinary situations can remain alive for centuries. Each reference to this war sparks curiosity, evokes a smile, and above all reminds us that history is not limited to dates and events. It lives in the human experience of marveling at the unexpected. The connection between laughter and memory also demonstrates how learning can be light. Lessons about patience, bureaucracy, chance, and curiosity are transmitted without dramatization, simply through the contrast between expectation and reality. The Scilly War teaches that life does not always need to be serious to be meaningful, and that attention to subtle details can reveal stories that challenge our understanding of time and formality. This historical laughter is not trivial. It has pedagogical and emotional value. It invites us to perceive that history is often a living narrative, capable of teaching through humor, irony, and charm. It reminds us that collective memory preserves not only heroism or tragedy, but also absurdities that connect us to the human experience in a profound and delightful way. The Isles of Scilly War came to an end without direct witnesses, without applause or noisy celebrations. In this case, peace was not proclaimed on battlefields nor announced in national newspapers with grand headlines. It settled quietly, almost invisibly, marked only by formal signatures and the mutual acknowledgement that, officially, the conflict had ended. This absence of witnesses is fascinating because it reminds us that history does not always need an audience to exist. The war lasted centuries without anyone truly noticing, and its conclusion was carefully recorded by just a few, as if time had decided that no spectacle was necessary for anyone to understand that everything was resolved. There is something profoundly poetic in this. Peace manifests in silence, away from curious eyes, yet still carries meaning. The idea of a silent peace also invites reflection on the nature of memory. Few island residents even noticed immediate changes in their routines. The world continued its course, the wind kept blowing, the waves continued breaking against the rocks, and boats sailed as usual. And yet, history preserved the record of the conflict's end. It is a reminder that peace can exist independently of general perception. It does not need witnesses to be real. There is something comforting about this silence. Unlike wars that leave visible scars, the Scilly War ended without injuries, without pain. Peace required no celebrations or speeches. A simple handshake, a formal signature, and mutual acknowledgement were enough. It reminds us that sometimes the most significant acts happen quietly, away from the eyes of those seeking grandeur. The concept of peace without witnesses also reflects the paradox of bureaucracy. The formality of the document gave reality to the war, even without confrontations. Likewise, the signature that ended the conflict gave existence to peace, even if no one was present to see it. It is a curious phenomenon. Documented actions create reality, whether or not there is an audience, showing the silent power of recorded history. This silent peace leads us to think about the value of presence and absence. The war lasted so long because no one noticed it. Peace occurred almost invisibly because the world had already moved on. Daily life, the rhythm of the islands, continued independently of the formality of documents. And yet, both the war and the peace remained recorded, like memories that reveal themselves only to those who look into the archives with attention and curiosity. Reflecting on this absence of witnesses, we also perceive the beauty of the unexpected. Peace manifested gently, without fanfare, and teaches us that not everything important needs to be observed. Some events find meaning only in formality and record, not in spectacle or notoriety. It is a lesson in humility from history. Greatness does not always need to be public. The Isles of Scilly War reveals, above all, the irony of time. A conflict that lasted 335 years without firing a single shot forces us to reflect on how time, with its infinite patience, shapes history in unexpected ways. The irony lies in the simultaneity of duration and inaction, a conflict stretching across centuries, yet leaving no visible mark on the daily lives of people. This irony is almost poetic. While empires rose and fell, revolutions unfolded, and social changes took place, the Scilly War remained suspended in a bureaucratic limbo. There were no battles, no soldiers, no heroes, no victims, only formal records ensuring its existence. It is as if time itself decided to play with history, showing that its passage does not always align with our expectations of significant events. The paradox becomes even deeper when we consider the resolution of the conflict. After centuries, the war ended simply, almost casually. A signature, a handshake, a symbolic gesture that concluded a dispute that, in practice, never existed. The irony lies in the contrast between the absurd duration and the lightness of the conclusion. An episode that could have been dramatic transformed into a fable about patience, bureaucracy, and human curiosity. This reflection on time leads us to think about human perception. For the islanders, the war was non-existent. They lived their lives normally, oblivious to the formalities persisting in the records. Time, in this context, seemed to play with reality. While documents recorded conflict, life went on serenely, as if mocking the bureaucracy that prolonged the war. It is a reminder that official history does not always coincide with daily experience. The irony of time also manifests in the discovery and resolution of the conflict. Roy Duncan, driven by curiosity, found records that might otherwise have remained forgotten forever. Chance combined with human attention, proving that even after centuries, time allows the past to reveal itself unexpectedly. The war only ended when someone noticed it and decided to act, showing that time is patient, but human perception gives meaning to its passage. Moreover, the irony of time reminds us that everyday life is more resilient than we imagine. The Isles of Scilly continued to exist, unchanged, even under the formal weight of a centuries-old conflict. People's routines, the movement of the sea, and the rhythm of the seasons did not bend to the imposition of ancient documents. This silent constancy is a reminder that practical reality can coexist with historical formality in a surprisingly harmonious way. Finally, the Scilly War teaches us that time can be both long and light, absurd and instructive. It prolongs, transforms, and reveals stories, defying logic and our expectations. The laughter, reflection, and surprise that emerge when revisiting this episode are fruits of time's patience, which allowed a conflict without battles to span centuries and reach us, ready to teach and enchant. The Isles of Scilly War, despite leaving no physical scars or records of combat, left an unexpected legacy, a delicate mark on history and cultural memory. It is curious to think that something that never actually happened can still be remembered, studied, and recounted centuries later, as if its impact were invisible yet real. This legacy shows us that history is not measured solely by confrontations or destruction, but also by the attention we give to extraordinary episodes, even when they are silent. The legacy begins with the story of the episode itself. The narrative of a war that lasted 335 years without a single shot spans books, articles, and historical curiosities, inspiring historians, journalists, and the curious alike. It is a reminder that the absurd, when documented and preserved, transforms into learning, reflection, and even enchantment. Moreover, it allows people to perceive that human reality is full of contradictions which, when understood, reveal humor, poetry, and irony. There is also a symbolic legacy, linked to the idea of patience and the power of time. The Scilly War teaches us that events can extend far beyond what we imagine, and that resolving a conflict does not always need to be immediate. The final signature, discreet and almost casual, shows that solutions can emerge gently, without grandeur, yet still leave a lasting mark on historical perception. This type of legacy is silent but profound, able to span generations quietly. The episode also reinforces the legacy of human curiosity. Roy Duncan's action in researching old archives demonstrates how individual attention can transform the past into the present, rescuing forgotten stories and giving them renewed significance. This legacy is inspirational. It teaches that curiosity, however small, has the power to connect what was, what is, and what can be understood, keeping alive details that might otherwise be lost. Furthermore, there is a cultural legacy of reflection and humor. The War Without Battles has become a classic example of how history can be both entertaining and instructive. Its absurdity makes us laugh, think, and imagine, offering a contemplative pause amid the flow of conventional narratives. This collective memory transforms into an intellectual heritage, shared by those who delight in the strangeness of life and human history. The legacy also resides in the way it connects us to bureaucracy and formality. The episode reminds us that simple acts, like documents and signatures, can endure for centuries and keep events alive in memory, even if they never manifested physically. This silent constancy is a reminder of the power of recorded words and the unexpected impact that formal structures can have on our perception of the past. Finally, the unexpected legacy of the Scilly War is a lesson about perceiving reality and constructing history. It teaches us that a physical conflict is not always necessary to leave a mark, and that the absurd, when approached with attention, curiosity, and reflection, can become a collective heritage of learning, humor, and enchantment. It is proof that history is alive, that time is patient, and that the most singular details can echo through the centuries. We have reached the end of the story of the Isles of Scilly War, a conflict that lasted 335 years without anyone fighting. No shots fired, no trenches dug, no flags burned. It is an episode that challenges our perception of time, formality, and reality, but also offers a space for contemplation, almost poetic, about life, absurdity, and the quiet peace that often surrounds us unnoticed. This war shows us that the absurd can endure. A war that never actually happened, kept alive only through records and bureaucracy, reminds us that reality is not always what it seems. Official documents existed, yet the islanders lived for centuries in peace, unaware of a conflict preserved only on paper. There is something profoundly curious and serene in that. Life goes on, and yet history remains recorded, waiting to be rediscovered. As we reflect on this episode, we realize that peace, even when silent, has value. The absence of battles, the tranquility of daily life, and the gentle rhythm of time reveal that life can unfold fully without major confrontations. The peace of the Isles of Scilly, established without witnesses and formalized through an almost casual signature, teaches us that the significance of an event does not always depend on its visibility. Sometimes, its essence lies in the serenity with which it occurs. The absurd also brings us closer to contemplative laughter. Laughing at a war that lasted over 3 centuries without a single shot reminds us that history does not need to be only dramatic or tragic. It can be light, instructive, and even enjoyable. This gentle, introspective laughter connects us to human curiosity, showing how small actions, a bit of research, a careful look, a signature, can transform forgotten events into stories that delight and teach. Reflecting on the Scilly War is, at the same time, reflecting on time itself. Time stretches patiently, spans centuries, allows mistakes, oversights, and absurdities to linger, and yet, eventually, offers the opportunity for resolution. Time teaches us to wait, to contemplate, to observe without haste, and to find beauty even in the most unexpected situations. It is a reminder that patience is a form of quiet wisdom, capable of transforming what seemed absurd into a lasting lesson. And there is something deeply comforting in this realization. History, even when strange, can gently guide us toward reflection. By tracing the path of a war that never happened, we learn about bureaucracy, curiosity, irony, patience, and the subtle lightness that can exist in formal situations. Every detail, every signature, every preserved record becomes an invisible thread connecting past and present, reminding us that historical knowledge can be both fascinating and serene. If this story enchanted you, if you felt the contrast between absurdity and reality, I invite you to leave a comment. Sharing thoughts helps keep these stories alive, while also creating a community of curious minds, dreamers, and explorers of human memory. If you enjoyed it, a like is a quiet form of recognition, just as subscribing to the channel is. Subscribing is not only to follow future stories but to ensure that these strange and charming episodes continue to reach you, bringing reflection, calm, and lightness. Now, close your eyes. Let this real absurdity dissolve into the fog of your dreams. Imagine the Isles of Scilly, the gentle wind, the calm sea, and the silent eternity of a peace that never needed witnesses. Breathe slowly, feel the rhythm of time slow down, and allow the lessons, humor, and serenity of history to gently merge into your sleep. Good night.